down perhaps to the grassroots level, perhaps not. But our first speaker on the second panel here will be Professor Prerna Singh, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Government here at Harvard. She has completed a very interesting book-length manuscript on subnational identities in India and the influence that they have on local public goods provision, issues of health provisions, and education in different parts of India. And Prerna, I think, will talk a bit about some of the differences between China and India on these dimensions.
Thanks, Liz. I have to confess, as the most undistinguished member of a very distinguished panel, I'm glad that I will be speaking first, and I encourage you to really pay much more attention to my fellow panelists. This really represents a very initial attempt to think about, and it actually follows quite nicely from Professor, a lot of the things that were brought up in the previous panel. And so the general question really is one that, as you can see, motivated many of the comments and questions in the previous panel, which is one of the differences in state capacity between China and India. And state capacity is widely believed to be one of the most defining characteristics of any political system, and at the most general level you might see it as the ability of the state to formulate and implement strategies to achieve its social and economic goals. And according to really almost any definition or measurement of state capacity, with kind of Tarun's very nice exception, you might say that the contemporary Chinese state exhibits greater capacity than its counterpart in India. And I want to highlight this really with giving you a contrast in two different but dramatic realms. And the first is one that has already been touched upon, which is that of human development. And we talked a lot about differences in education, but of course, as was already indicated, these differences, of course, translate also into public health outcomes. For instance, just to give you a kind of broad picture, a Chinese woman is over 6 times less likely to die during childbirth, and on average expected to live about 4 more years than her average Indian counterpart. And again, you can see this in a variety of indicators, and I think this was mentioned as one of the questions, is that, about half of all Indian children, which is the highest proportion of children in any country in the world, including sub-Saharan Africa, are stunted. And, again, I could line up almost every indicator of public health as well as of education, and you would see the same kind of dramatic contrasts. And to kind of take it to a very different realm, you might also, if you think of the hosting of an international sporting event, which I admit is not a classic instance of state capacity, but I argue could be seen as yet another instance, you see that in the contrast between the Beijing Olympics and the Delhi Commonwealth Games. And despite a lot of hesitation about the Beijing Olympics prior to its start, the international community as well as the press was quite unequivocal in, basically, lauding China for a spectacular set of games. And on the other hand, something that's somewhat of a kind of personal tragedy for someone not only from India but from Delhi was the Commonwealth Games, which were defined as a disaster of failure and embarrassment for those of you who followed it. Stadiums collapsed, footbridges collapsed, there were rats and dogs in the athlete stadium, and many high-profile athletes actually withdrew, and there was a real threat of the cancellation of the games. And so I argue not only in the realm of human development, which we've talked about, but also in something quite dramatic and recent as a hosting of an international sporting events, you see these differences in state capacity. And so the question I want to ask is what underlies these differences? And these are a set of very ill thought out thoughts, which are getting their first airing, and it's just tragic that it has to be such a public airing today. And so, I would really urge you to think about it as thoughts and respond to them as such. So, in particular, in terms of the international sporting events, this contrast was not lost, in particular in the international press. And so this was in The Independent, which is a UK newspaper. They said that the most galling thing for the Indians is this contrast that this provides with China. And the tragedy for India is that whatever happens in Delhi, the world will conclude that this is yet another area where India cannot match its Asian rival. And so these contrasts were, I think, quite explicitly made. So, there are obviously very prominent explanations for these differences in state capacity, and I won't go into them in as much detail as I thought, partly because they have been dealt with, I think, quite nicely on the previous panel. So one of them, of course, is the fact that China is an authoritarian state under the control of a communist party, while India has been a multi-party democracy. Of course, there are differences in rates of economic development. India and China are usually considered to be these emerging global economic superpowers, but of course, China begins its acceleration almost a decade prior to India. And there's also ethnic homogeneity, which Professor Yashang Huang brought up as an example. But usually, economists consider ethnic diversity to be an impediment to state capacity, particularly in the area of public goods provision. And according to that argument, an ELF score really just measures the probability that you will encounter someone from a different linguistic group. So the probability of, on average, encountering someone from a different linguistic group is only 15% in China, and it is over 40% in India. And so you might argue that this underlies differences in state capacity. And what I want to briefly suggest is that while I'm not arguing that these are not important, I do think that they, on a very, very cursory analysis, do not do a great job of explaining differences in state capacity. I mean, in terms of, I think the question of the difference between an authoritarian and a democratic state has been well brought out, but usually the relationship is that democracies are supposed to do better than dictatorships in terms of public goods provision. And similarly, you might argue that a communist state, might do better because of ideological commitment to a reduction of material and human deprivation. And there it is the case that the Communist Party has obviously been critical to China's public health achievements, but then you look at other Marxist-Leninist states that haven't been able to do as good a job. And India, as has already been mentioned, was under socialist planning, 5-year plans, nationally owned enterprises, and Nehru, who had a defining really influence in India in its early post-independence years, was deeply influenced by Marxist-Leninist ideology. And in terms of economic development, the critical thing is China makes its most significant gains in public health at the time when its level of economic development is actually lower than that of India, which is from the 1950s to the 1970s. But so both in terms of levels and rates of growth, China's greatest achievements happen not at a time when it's actually growing economically. And in India, despite very high rates of economic growth since the 1990s, the Indian state has not done a very good job in improving public health or other kinds of human development outcomes. In fact, at its level of economic development, India has one of the lowest levels of public goods provision of any country in the world. And this is lower than Bangladesh, for instance, just to give you an example, which is India's South Asian neighbor. Its GNP is about half of that of India, and its public goods provision and social development outcomes are higher than India on almost every indicator. And finally, in terms of ethnic homogeneity, this is a point I think that's already been mentioned, which is that China didn't start off as ethnically homogeneous. And so I do think that ethnic homogeneity to some extent is endogenous to state policies, and that there was a policy historically which made China Chinese and was not successful. I think national language policy was mentioned, which actually prevented India, or at least did not help its level of ethnic heterogeneity. But I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more. So what I want to suggest is that, it's, as I said, it is controversial and very ill thought out, but I want to mention that historical experiences with statehood might make a difference to levels of state capacity. And here I'm really just initially starting off thinking about how long a state has been around. And so, in terms of people who have social science scholars who've compared India and China, Hegel, Weber, Professor Dwara, Fukuyama, have all kind of mentioned this idea that China is a strong state and a weak society, and India is a strong society and a weak state. And I think Professor Dwara's book actually complicates this, and actually Professor Sai's work shows that you can't actually, very simply say that China has no society or a weak society. But I do think that there is something to it. And so Hegel, who was perhaps the first comparator of India and China, said that if China may be regarded as nothing but a state, Hindu political existence prevents us with a people but no state. And I was actually rereading Professor Dwara's book this morning and realized it's also a quote that he uses in his book.